E-commerce business owners know a successful business keeps customers happy. That's why smart retailers use ShipStation. Turn shoppers into loyal customers with cheaper, faster, and better shipping. Manage all your orders and returns in one place and save up to 90% on rates from all the global carriers. Go to shipstation.com/program to sign up for your free trial. No credit card required, and you can cancel anytime. That's shipstation.com/program.
You've landed at Spark Launch, the guide star for embracing what it means to be neurodiverse. I'm Mike Cornell, joined by CEO of Spark Launch, Chaya. Here, we navigate mental health triumphs and tribulations from all across the spectrum, charting a course to the shared experiences that unite us, and discovering how to embody the unique strengths within neurodivergent and neurotypical alike, igniting your spark and launching it into a better tomorrow. Hello there. I'm Mike.
I'm Chaya.
And today we want to welcome onto the show LaToya Hinton, PhD, a grant writer, mixed methods researcher, data analyst, and Python programmer. Her PhD is in multilingual, multicultural, and indigenous education. She served as an instructional designer building DEIAB coursework and conducting workshops on the topic for K-12 educators. She served as team lead for UX research and communications. She is a diversity, equity, inclusion, accessibility, and belonging thought leader and a champion for neurodivergent women leaders. She is co-owner of the LinkedIn group Neurodivergent Women Leaders Creative Mentorship and Support. She facilitates peer support group sessions with Forum called Neurodivergent Women Team Leads Become a Transformational Leader. LaToya is a late identified, late realized, late diagnosed autistic, dyspraxic, dyscalculic ADHDer who is gifted. Welcome on the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here and get a chance to chat with you both.
LaToya, I see you're very active on LinkedIn, and that's how we met. I didn't realize you ran the women's neurodiversity group on LinkedIn. There seems to be this need for you to share and to empower women and neurodivergent folks. Where is that coming from?
I think it comes from my training from academia. Honestly, I was taught when I focused on education reform to be an advocate. And I think advocacy comes in lots of different forms. And I think for the neurodivergent community, part of what I'm seeing is that a lot of women my age are kind of like just now realizing that they are neurodivergent and they need these safe spaces to talk about the discovery journey. But then there's also this sort of flip side where a lot of them feel empowered to actually talk about their successes and like their strengths. And I think in the mainstream media, we haven't really heard a whole lot about that from a neurodivergent perspective, from someone who has kind of created their own like structures and like really leaned into their strengths in like school and career settings. And so that's really refreshing. And I think that's what kind of motivates me and keeps me coming back to doing that kind of community building work, whether it's on LinkedIn or whether it's like face-to-face in real life, or whether, you know, it's a combination of both virtual and face-to-face community building.
Yeah, I think as neurodivergent individuals, we experience a lot of challenges just because the world is not built for us. And when we get on the other side of overcoming the challenges, we want to scream from the rooftops and tell the world, hey, it doesn't have to be that difficult. We want to share our secrets. We want to empower people who might still be struggling. And for me, it hurts when I see people suffer. And so I can see why you want to share some of your skills and your discoveries along the journey. Tell us, what were your challenges and some of the skills you've learned and your secrets of overcoming those challenges?
Yeah. So when I look back on my childhood and like my experience with education, I always kind of saw myself as a bookworm. I was a really good student in a lot of ways. I created a lot of structures for myself. So I distinctly remember getting up really early in the morning, and I had like an office that I could go into. My parents had medical billing business. And so they had like an office in our home where they did a lot of, collaborating with like local doctors and doing that kind of work. And so it's kind of funny because like they had like a hybrid environment. They did a lot of remote work back then, but they didn't, have Zoom and all of that. But then they would go face to face and communicate with people, their colleagues and stuff like that. So it was kind of like I had that as an example of like you could go to a space and just be really serious, and like do all of your work. And we had like a personal computer and a business computer in that office. And so whatever I had needed, I had access to that. And so I would create like a quiet space for myself. And sometimes I would put like music on, and I would also pay attention to like the temperature and the lighting and all of that. So I almost like created my own accommodations for myself, like a comfortable space to do work. And like I said, I would get up super early in the morning, like 5:30 or something like that, before like anybody else, before like my brother was awake and my parents and stuff. And I thought that was totally normal. I thought that like that's what all young children did in school. I had no idea at that time that like I would just get distracted really easily. And that was like the inattentive ADHD. Like, and then in classes, face to face with my teachers and stuff like that, I would always kind of like ask questions after class. I didn't like have my hand up all the time. I wasn't like disruptive in class. Like I very much conformed to the system that was like a high level of discipline and like strictness. And then when I got into education reform, like in graduate school, I realized that there's kind of a difference between schooling and education, right? Education can come in lots of different forms. Like it can be like self-led learning and doesn't necessarily have to have, a teacher in the front of a classroom. But schooling tends to be about discipline, right? And so it tends to focus on, like classroom management, for instance. It's one of the sort of buzz terms that we would always hear about in the education space. And lots of teachers are explicitly trained how to manage the like behaviors of their students essentially in classes. And so that's very much a schooling kind of, way to address learning. But I think for neurodivergent youth, a lot of us get, and now I'm not really like a youth, but I would say like from my experience when I was a youth, I would say that we really get caught up on the behavioral stuff quite a bit and maybe have a hard time like separating that out because it's all woven together in the system, So I think when I was a child as well, like my brother was getting like in trouble, like he was getting reprimanded a lot in school. He was always going to the principal's office. And I think it was just for like speaking out of turn and like joking in class and doing things that were seen as bad behavior. And so I did like the complete opposite of him. Like I was really on eggshells all the time, like worried about being disciplined. So I was just kind of very strict with myself. And I had like very high expectations for myself in that way. I turned out to be a perfectionist, honestly, from that environment. And then as an adult, speaking to like therapists, they talk to me about the downsides of being a perfectionist and being like a hypervigilant about your behaviors. So it's, I think it definitely, there's a balance that can be achieved, in terms of being someone who's concerned about like clarity in your communication and having a strong sense of attention to detail and things like that. I think like a lot of those are very positive things that can help you in lots of different aspects of your career and your life. But I think when you're so hyper-focused on that and you're not concerned about your well-being, for instance, like that's where it starts getting into an area where you need an intervention. And I think a lot of us have gotten there, especially the late realized, late diagnosed neurodivergent people.
Perfectionism can be a double-edged sword. it can be a good thing as well because that gives you quality. But as you said, if it stops you from progressing, from moving forward, then it can be harmful and it can affect your mental health and just progress. So, what did you learn along the way till now? What were the things that helped you overcome some of the challenges that you experience with ADHD? Because none of these things that we're talking about, they don't talk about that in school, right? We're not taught about these things. In fact, we are forced to become a perfectionist depending on how we experience it. Just like how you experience was so different from what your brother experienced.
I would say one of the things that when I look back on my success in school, I used to be like, again, this kind of comes from the perfectionist kind of point of view, but I was very independent. And when I look back on my education and why I was successful, like being independent wasn't necessarily always the key to success. I think like being in groups of people like who could support me was super, super important. So like when I think about like being in college or in graduate school, people who had sort of like interest groups that could help me, like for instance, that group focused on writing skills, right? Like those were the spaces where I felt like if I was getting kind of like stressed out on my own doing things by myself, I could kind of go to that group and say, hey, are other people experiencing something similar? Or like maybe there's some tips that I'm missing out on. So I had a lot of those kind of like study groups or spaces where people were maybe like in the same classes as me or like they were doing similar coursework. And then there were lots of skill sets that they could kind of help me attain. So I think like filling in like gaps or helping me if I got confused by something or if I got overwhelmed by something, those were some spaces that I think we don't talk about enough that are like, and you have to have a certain amount of what we call like social capital in order to like continue to occupy those spaces and to seek them out. Because I think if that is something that is tricky to do, I know folks who may have some issues with like communication or like sustaining peer groups, like that may present some issues. And so I think I say that the support groups throughout my education really helped me. But I would say like it's not the only way to be successful, but it's like one of the things that can help you as a neurodivergent person because you're not going at it alone and you're not assuming that, you know, there's something inherently wrong with you or something if you don't have the skills that you need. Instead, it just kind of like allows you to grow and progress from where you're at. So that sort of collective community building within the education space, I think it gets overlooked, but was definitely a huge piece of my success in school.
I've thought a lot about how groups are beneficial to the neurodivergent. And one of the things I personally like about it, and I found this with many others, is it is low stakes socialization in that it has a beginning and it has an end, and then you can move on. Like it doesn't have that background worry about, you know, how long this is going to go on, or you can also, you know, maybe not attend if you want to. It's like it's the optional, it's the kind of easy bookends to it. And I think that's why it's such a great, valuable tool whenever you need to learn life skills or just need someone to socialize with. It's a good place to float over to.
Yeah, I agree. And I almost kind of wish too that we would talk about it in terms of, instead of it just being like, it's a study group, like maybe there's more to it than that. Like maybe you're building other social skills when you're in that group and then thinking about like the social emotional learning within that group, right? Like maybe if you're open and it's a safe space and you have like the ability to talk to your peers about like any kind of like mental health issues that you're going through or something like that, I think makes it even more supportive because then who knows, like other people in the group might be going through similar things. And then maybe they have some recommendations for you in terms of what worked for them. So I almost kind of feel when I look back on it that maybe I could have done even more sort of self-advocacy kind of work and like opening up a little bit more about like mental health when I was in those groups, because I really didn't do that. Like I kind of kept it like, this is about, us helping each other to be successful in this particular coursework, right? And it didn't really move into like the personal life sphere. And I kind of wish that it did, because looking back on it, I probably wouldn't have had as many issues with anxiety and depression and stuff if I had just been able to open up about some of those things. But it's still, mental health tends to still be stigmatized in our society. So I think it's something that is worth talking about and worth working through for the neurodivergent community for sure.
Absolutely. Mental health is something that needs to be talked over and again, and there's nothing wrong with it. And it's not permanent, right? It need not be a permanent feature and should be accepted. If I look back at my own anxiety, thank God for my friends, really, who I could be myself with them, and they gave me their strength to go show up to some of the exams. And when I look at my anxiety, it was to do with the result. And I think that's the problem, at least with me, where I was forced to look at the result. So when you let go of the outcome, then you can just show up and do your best and trust in that moment. And it's okay if it's not perfect. It's okay if you don't achieve the number that you wanted to achieve, right? All of that have helped me overcome my anxiety, and I learned to trust in the moment and go with the flow. I wish somebody had taught me that, and it was not about grades, but the way the world is built, there's so much emphasis on numbers, even when it comes to jobs and things like that. So one of my biggest things is I stopped listening to that noise from others over a period of time and just listened to my heart. But these are skills that nobody talks about in school.
Yeah. And then just like when I think about like leadership and some of the topics that I talk about a lot with transformational leadership is like motivation and purpose and your vision and that kind of stuff. Like, oh man, neurodivergent people have so much to contribute with that. The decisions in our careers are not always about the numbers. They tend to be like a lot of the neurodivergent women leaders that I talk about like a lot of like holistic reasons for why they're doing what they're doing, like whether they're doing, wellness coaching or they are doing some sort of career coaching or whether they are, a team lead. The way that they orient themselves to the work tends to be about like what kind of positive impact they're going to make overall. Right. So they a lot of them kind of think about like sustainability. They're concerned about how can I mentor my team members so that they can shine and then like stay on with the organization for a long period of time. So they tend to look at like the bigger picture in their decision making. And that's hard because sometimes the pushback is sort of like about some sort of immediate outcomes or some sort of performance metrics that don't take the long term into consideration. And so for me, like when it isn't a human first approach, I tend to kind of go into a meltdown because a lot of my purpose and my vision for my career and just like advocacy and what I can do to build community, all of that just kind of gets like thrown out the window when it's not a human first approach. And then I just kind of like go into like I have to get myself into a safe space. I have to get out of here. And I don't think that most people who are not neurodivergent experience that, right? Like, I think they, for the most part, are like, well, like as long, as I can take care of myself and take care of my family members that's kind of like the most important thing. And then it would be nice to create a safe space. It would be nice to build trusting relationships, but that doesn't always happen, right? But I think for me, I feel like the creating trusting relationships, creating safe spaces for people to express themselves, that's like number one. Like I can't work in an environment if that is not the case, because I don't see myself thriving in an environment like that. I see myself going into meltdown or burnout.
And it's so easy we do have those particular yearnings to do something that on a larger scale, take on a lot of managing emotions for everyone around us to try to reach that goal. And we often forget about managing our own emotions and the weight of often what our goal is and what our work is starts to get very crushing, and we don't notice it until usually we're on the ground. And what are some of the best ways to kind of like be mindful of yourself and guard yourself from that kind of empathetic overload in those situations?
Gosh, this is such a great question because I'm such an empath, and I do feel when people are suffering in like a visceral way. And so I've had to start to put in like some boundaries in the sense of I'll give an example. Like if somebody comes to me and like asks for lots of advice and they're going through a really tough time in their life, and, they have the expectation that I like immediately help them. One of the things that I've been starting to do, which is really great for boundary setting, is delegating. What I do is I give a certain amount of help and then I delegate the rest to someone else, because I've created this ability for me to like recharge my emotion. And I need that space to kind of like relax, sort of recuperate, and then like come back in and be able to help again, right? Like I've realized that in my head now that me helping is not unlimited. Like I have to set those limits in order for me to continue to provide help and advocacy and do that kind of work. So I think it is that of just, you need almost like a team of people that can kind of like step in and help you to do your advocacy work, to do, anything that you're doing that's supportive and helpful for folks. And that could be, like helping people to solve problems and, give, guidance and mentorship. Even with the guidance and mentorship, sometimes you have to say, I'm going to delegate a little bit of this, and then I'll come back in and help when I'm recharged. And I think a lot of it as well has to do with like healing from trauma as well. Like that is a huge piece of it. And it's something that we also don't talk about enough, is that a lot of us have been traumatized in certain environments that weren't safe, right? And like weren't trusting. And we're still coming back from that, we're still coming back from those experiences that we had. And so I'm realizing that it's about not overspending like my batteries, but it's also about realizing that I'm in the healing process as well. I don't ever want to turn down anyone who needs help, but I think the best way for me to manage my own well-being is to like do a little bit at a time.
Delegation, it's so important. And that's what keeps the flow going and the consistency, which we kind of lack, like just keep going blindly, because we need to recharge that batteries, because our passion is coming from inside, and there's this whole human factor to it, right, which you talked about. And so that delegation enables you to create that consistent flow of energy, and it doesn't become choppy, which is what I think a lot of neurodivergent folks experience, the challenges. Yeah, because they might start something and stop it, right? And this is, but when you become a part of a large group and you can manage to keep that juice flowing.
Yeah, consistency is really big. Like when I think about just thinking about my career and how many intense interests and passions I had over the years and like projects that I, have started, how do you sort of carry through with the momentum, right? Like, how do you weave all of the pieces together? Like, one of the things that I mentioned in the Neurodivergent Women Leaders Creative Mentorship and Support group on LinkedIn is being like a Renaissance woman. Like, that's something that a lot of ADHDers and ADHDers talk about a lot, that we like to dabble into lots of different things. But I think the downside is not being able to follow through on the things that you're dabbling in. The upside is, how do you follow through with having so many different things going on at the same time? And so I think like paying attention to how to create synchronicity, like how to connect lots of different interests together. That is something that I focus on a regular basis so that I keep my sanity, number one, and two, like I don't get bored. Because I think like that is really, really huge, because you want to keep things fresh and you want to stay innovative. But at the same time, you have to realize that you have to connect lots of dots in order to stay consistent and keep your momentum going.
I think that's where intuition plays a role in connecting the dots. In the multiple projects that we have, how do we create this beautiful piece of energy from all our energies, interests in different various aspects? Because there is a connection, and that's why we are called for it, right? We are learning something. Even a single conversation, I've learned something, and then in my quiet space, I put them all together, right? This conversation with Mike, something happens in my head that I can weave out the story.
Yeah, I would say storytelling is huge. Storytelling is huge because if you're able to create a narrative that explains your decision making in your career, that really helps people to relate to why it seems like all these disparate connections are being made, right? Like, it just makes it very simplified for people to come in kind of from the outside and see why you made the decisions that you did, because in your mind, you have a master plan for why you are choosing all of these sort of different routes. But it also is just that spiky profile, right? It's just kind of, I noticed that what I would do is if, I was confused with one thing, I could try out something else. And that was kind of like part of the problem solving, right? Sort of like, okay, I'll give an example because I'm dyscalculic. So when I was in school, I really struggled with memorizing arithmetic problems. And so a lot of my teachers in math would say, oh, well, like you can't get into the advanced level math if you can't do the basics. And for them, doing the basics meant memorizing. And for me, I kind of had to figure out, how do I still go into things like data analytics and data science if I don't have foundational math, right? So I had to problem solve. And the way that I did that was I would use like visual aids to help me understand the concepts. And so I see myself doing that quite a bit, that when I run into a challenge or a barrier, I go into the problem solving mode. And usually that is looking for something that my brain can understand and can connect to in order to get to my ultimate goal. And so I think like for neurodivergent youth, that is something that we can like emphasize in the education space, as well as like when you see a challenge or a barrier, like rather than just kind of shutting down and saying, my brain can't do that. Instead, like look for what your brain can connect to, and then see whether you can like use that to aid you to get to where you want to go. And one of the things that I found like in my 30s was like these programs on the computer, like they're like sort of like tutoring programs that will teach you higher level math. One of them is called Brilliant, and it just uses visuals and diagrams. And so I was like, oh, now I can do calculus. Like now I can understand derivatives and integrals and all of this stuff that I didn't think I would ever be able to understand. But it's because there are lots of diagrams and and charts and visuals that walk me through the process. And I remember looking back on my education, like back in primary school, I was like really good at geometry. And like in high school and college, I did really well with like trigonometry and like anything that had visuals, like I would always just ace those courses. So that was, where my brain just connected. And so just like kind of paying attention to that, like what makes your brain kind of tick, and like what helps you to sort of overcome what seems like an insurmountable challenge.
I have dyscalculia as well, as you're describing a lot of similar experience to me. I need the visual representation of a lot of it. Otherwise, I'm not going to be able to get it. It's hard for me to grasp a lot of it. And especially when it comes to memorizing anything involving numbers, my brain can barely actually read numbers sometimes.
Yeah.
I have a hard time, connecting them whenever I actually see them. So I taught myself, algebra essentially. And I did that through visual aids and having to like really break it down. I had to, use my autistic need for understanding why of everything to help me understand how like each components of a simple equation worked. And then I was able to build out from there. Not saying I didn't forget all of it over the course of months and months and years, but I still did it the one time. So that was helpful.
And that's enough, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. Not just to do it once. That gives you the validation that like, I can definitely do this. And I've like figured out like a method, I've got my own method for it.
Yeah. And that's it. You just have to find your way in. You have to find the particular individual's way of wrapping their mind around something that is a brick wall, that seems like a brick wall, but it's not a brick wall. It's the fork in the road. You just have to go down like a longer way to get there, but you can still get there. It's just a lot of trial and error. You mentioned being late realized. I'm always interested in getting the perspectives of kind of how was your internal reaction to that? And also how was the external reaction to that?
Oh my gosh, great question. I would say for me, internally, I was dealing with the anxiety and depression from a really young age. So like my dad, for instance, I remember him buying me a bird. And that was his way of like helping me manage depression and anxiety. I didn't know at the time that it was like connected to my experience at school, and that I was like probably having a hard time with like social interactions, or like that I maybe felt like a lot of pressure or like sort of high expectations. And that was sort of weighing on me as a child. And I didn't really have a space to release that. Like I couldn't put those things together as a child, like that. I couldn't connect the dots and ask my parents, oh, maybe there's something wrong here. Like maybe I should go to some sort of screening, or I should try to figure out what. I just didn't make any of those connections as a child. As an adult, looking back on it, I think probably the school environment, certain things were not accessible. And so they were coming out as anxiety and depression, like symptoms for me. And so in adulthood, I felt the stigma of talking about mental health. So I just would keep it all to myself. Like I just wouldn't say anything to people who were close to me. So whether that was like advisors or like, instructors, people that I, trusted and like built trusting relationships with, like I still didn't feel like open to be able to tell them about mental health things. So I think I didn't make that connection of I'm having mental health issues. So maybe there's more to it than that. I think I just stuck with I'm probably just stressed out, like I'm probably just experiencing these cycles of stress in my life. And maybe those are just normal, ups and downs in life. And I just have to kind of go through these cycles of, having like anxiety attacks or like, isolating myself or like, I think I just thought after a while, I just normalized it so much. That was sort of the internal picture until I started to do like a deeper dive, because what happened was I got into like a mindfulness group for women, and a lot of the women in the group were like neurodivergent. And then we had the space to talk about our childhood experiences and our experiences as adults. And we have like multiple generations to look at as well, because I have women in that group who are Gen Z, those who are Gen Y and Gen X. So it's like 3 decades to be able to kind of compare experiences. And that's where I think a lot of the light bulbs kind of went off in my head. And I was like, oh, like I need to do a deep dive and understand what are all these different neurodivergent experiences and like, where do I fit in? And then I was able to kind of talk to a therapist, and she just like immediately like referred me to get ADHD medication. And like, so I think even just being able to like talk through the experience with peers allowed me the language to be able to talk to a specialist. Right. And then kind of like, that's how it sort of went from there. But I think if you don't have those spaces where you can be like open to possibilities and sort of talk through your experiences with people who have experienced similar things, that's where it is hard. Because if everybody around you is like, you're fine, like you're good, like you don't need assistance, you will never think that you need to inquire about neurodivergence.
If you're not able to speak your truth, that can lead to a lot of stress. We all have our truth, and our truth is valid. It's our story. And we're not able to share that to an empathetic ear. It can lead to stress. And stress can show up in weird ways. It can be anger. It can be anything else. So we have to look inside and look into the deep causes as to why, and question, because the answers are inside of us. And the more we question, we'll find the answers.
Yeah. And I think one of the things that Mike had mentioned about always wanting to know why, and that's something that a lot of autistic people talk about. They want to get to the bottom of what it is that they're experiencing. And I think that pattern recognition, like being able to connect the dots, is something that other autistic people talk about as well. So I think it sets the stage for doing those sort of like deep dives and like researching a lot to try to make connections. And then that's why a lot of us end up like doing the self-diagnosis, because we don't stop at sort of the surface level that maybe other people see. And we then start to kind of like go down a rabbit hole of like, how are all of these different things connected? And so like really early on, I was like, okay, like I've had anxiety and depression growing up. Then now the dyscalculia, like I took a couple of online assessments and I was like, oh, that makes sense. Right. And then you realize that these things are like co-occurring together. And then you're like, oh, okay, like let's look into this. And it kind of just like, it kind of becomes this just self-discovery journey where you're just making all of these connections. And then it's almost like you can do much more than a specialist might be able to do, because it's like, you know yourself really well. And also there's this part of like, usually when you get in front of someone who's in a space of authority, like you want to present yourself in a certain way. So I've noticed that like when I was in counseling sessions in the past, like I wouldn't talk necessarily about some of my struggles because I would want to show that I was doing well. and like, obviously that's not like the purpose of therapy, but I would kind of like be used to putting on a particular persona, like having a mask. And it's hard to step away from that and kind of like really be transparent, because you do have that sense of like, you're going to be judged and people may not see you in the same, positive light or something like that. And so that's another thing that a lot of like late diagnosed neurodivergent women don't really talk about, is that like a lot of us mask really, really well. And so it just, even when we're talking to therapists and even when we're talking to specialists, we tend to keep up appearances with the mask, because a lot of it is just fear-based, right? Like you just don't want to be judged, and you maybe don't want to lose control, because those are things that can happen, right? Is that you might be really, really vulnerable if you really talk about the struggles that you have on a day-to-day basis.
I love therapy. Also, I'm really bad at being in therapy, because it's just too much self-awareness, like, I don't know, if I make this certain face, then they'll probably think this is going through my head, so I should make this face instead. And then I end up realizing what they're going to say before they say it. It's a problem. And it's really hard to turn off, and I really can't to a large degree. I mostly just want to, I want to be open, and I want to be vulnerable in those situations, but my brain just starts going down the rabbit hole, and it starts kind of wanting to ask them questions more than them asking me questions, which is part of why my therapist was the one who pegged me as being autistic, funny enough. And I always say, I know there's a lot of controversy around self-diagnosis and stuff. And I do get that it's not like a total black and white thing. Of course, if you like watched a single TikTok video and then said you're autistic, that might be an issue. But an autistic's never going to really diagnose themselves as being neurodivergent, purely because the amount of research that is involved in doing the self-diagnosis would only be done by someone who's neurodivergent. Like, if I stopped at the surface level, I would go like, oh no, well, clearly I'm not autistic, or I clearly don't have ADHD or anything like that. Like, I don't like trains, just stuff like that. But it was like, no, I'm just going to keep going. Like, I need to actually hear people talk about it. I need to see like visual representations of every single shade of autism, so I can actually like get it. A regular person won't do that.
No. They're not going to really do the deep dives. I went to this website called Embrace Autism, and it is a site that was created by psychotherapists who are specialists on the topic, but then also a lot of them are autistic themselves. And it's a very inviting website, and you go and there's just tons and tons of assessments that you can take. And then their recommendation is like, after that, seek out a specialist and like get a formal diagnosis. But I think there's a lot of validation in that, of like taking those assessments and then kind of telling yourself like, yeah, I actually was on the right track. Like I wasn't just making things up. Like, so I think that there's kind of different ways of recognizing that you're on this self-discovery journey. And I think collaborating with people who are specialists and talking to people who have very, very different life experiences, but, consider themselves autistic or consider themselves ADHDers or, dyslexic, dyscalculic, just going down, any kind of neurodivergent. I think just getting around people who may have similar experiences to you and like collaborating with specialists and stuff like that allows you to do that deeper dive and be like, okay, like I'm probably on the right track here, or no, I was way off. Because I think otherwise, if, like you said, you just watch one TikTok video and you're like, that's me, that's the story of my life, like you might not really have the whole story.
Yeah, you would. And honestly, that proves that you're probably not, because we would not be satisfied with that.
Yeah.
And
we
it
actually have to watch like 50 TikToks
yes,
before we're like, all right, yeah, I'm on the right track.
if you're not going on research gates and read a paper at any point, then you're probably not autistic. But it helps to also know what to bring up to the specialists as well. I mean, there are so many things that I never realized were neurodivergent traits of my own till like years after my diagnosis. Years after, I was like, oh, that's why I do that. That's why I do that. That's why I always did that. Just things that were so ingrained as part of who I am that it would never occur to me to mention it as anything unusual, quote unquote. So knowledge is power, as they always say. But talking about, your advocacy work and everything that you do, what do you have coming up in the future, and what are you currently building to?
Yeah. So very early on, we talked about how we both work with Forum. So that's one project that I'm kind of working on. I have a couple of peer mentors who have joined the group. It's called Neurodivergent Women Changemakers, Become a Transformational Leader. And so that is about to start February the 20th. I'm super excited about that. Created like a whole format with lots of themes that we may or may not cover, but just to be prepared. Since it's my first group, I'm super excited about that. And I've been getting a lot of feedback from people who are like interested in joining or have already joined and are kind of telling me, yeah, this is along the lines of what we want to talk about or not. And that has been helping me to really launch that in a successful way. And then grant writing, I see that also as advocacy work because I want to help small businesses and nonprofits to be able to expand their services and like possibly like hire part-time and full-time staff members. I think that's really, really big when you have an idea and you don't just want that idea to come to fruition, but you want to sustain it and then do like community advocacy work. And a lot of folks in the neurodivergent community, like what would be better than to work for a company that like is proud to be neurodivergent. So I see that grant writing work as directly helping the neurodivergent community in terms of folks who are small business owners, or maybe they are a founder of a nonprofit. I'm not discriminating, could be for profit or nonprofit. And then I also just joined the board of Umbrella US, which is a nonprofit organization that just focuses on advocacy for neurodivergent adults. And that is really amazing because I'm able to offer lots of resources to help neurodivergent folks. And one of the things that we're focused on in that organization is health equity. So we're trying to make sure that with the current like political situation in the United States, like neurodivergent adults have access to medical care. And that comes in lots of different shapes and sizes, right? Because it's holistic in terms of what kinds of care we need. You know, we need all of it, preventative care and mental health and, you know, physical health, and all of it is tied together. So, you know, in order for us to thrive and in order for our families to thrive, we have to have access to those things.
Yeah, especially mental health care right now. Yeah. Talk about empathy overload. So that's great. I love that you're focusing on grant writing. You know, that is something that is so important, and people don't. I think they overlook the importance of roles like that, and especially if they are, you know, starting a nonprofit or anything, that how very much required it is and necessary it is. These are kind of like the unsung workers in the charitable sphere. But before we wrap up, what sort of takeaway would you like people who are listening to have involving what you are building from your life?
I think like kind of hearkening back to one of the things that I had mentioned, especially for neurodivergent youth, and like this is like for parents too, who are like imagining what their child's future might be like, that challenges and barriers can actually be opportunities. I think if you have that mindset and not like that surface level growth mindset scenario that sometimes has a lot of like toxic positivity in it, because it's a lot of the time doesn't address like true challenges, right? And like where you actually need help and support from, you know, maybe outside of your family, right? Like there are people who do like need additional support. So I don't want to de-emphasize that in any way with this like growth mindset. But I think, as I mentioned earlier with dyscalculia, like if I had known from a really young age that I could use visual aids to help me, like I never would have had any sort of traumatic experience in terms of like, you know, I'm terrible at math and I'll never get good at it, right? Like that kind of stuff, that sort of negativity you want to avoid. And if you can get access to resources at a young age and you realize that you can problem solve, then you really have no limits to what you're capable of doing when you enter into adulthood. And so I think that's one of the things that I think I want to emphasize for both like neurodivergent youth and then the parents of neurodivergent youth, is to like try to get access to as many resources as possible so that you can lean into your strengths and be a creative, innovative problem solver that like we all know you are.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And where can everybody find you and your work?
Yeah. So I'm definitely on LinkedIn. I think it's just LaToya-Hinton is just my profile on LinkedIn. I do have a doppelganger out there who I've actually worked with in the past, and her name is hyphenated, so there won't be any confusion there. But yeah, I believe it's just LaToya-Hinton. And then Toybird Positive Impact Funding is the name of my fledgling grant writing company. And then I mentioned Umbrella US. So I'll probably be posting on LinkedIn about any sort of events and partnerships coming up there. And I'll probably be posting on LinkedIn with anything that is happening with forum peer mentorship groups. So mainly find me on LinkedIn, and hopefully we can work together to create a positive impact for neurodivergent youth and adults moving forward.
Yes, 100%.
Thank you, LaToya, for everything that you do and coming on our show and sharing your journey with us.
Thank you. It's been awesome. It's been like soul searching in a really good way. So it was like awesome to have the opportunity to talk with you.
Yeah, this was fun. Thank you for joining us. And I hope everybody keeps an eye out at what you're doing. I'll be sure to put everything in the show notes, of course, which you can find at sparklaunchpodcast.com. Please, if you like this podcast, rate and review us on your favorite podcasting platform. But for us here at Spark Launch, we will see you next time.